Welcome to the first lecture in this year's series at the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. The mission of the Center for Values is to understand, evaluate, and to improve the ethical and cultural influences on and implications of science and technology. That's our mission. And the way we pursue that mission is through research in a variety of fields, including philosophy, history, social sciences, as well as education and public outreach efforts, including this event tonight. The topic of our lecture series this year is food for thought. And that simple question in the subtitle of the series, what shall we eat, what should we eat? It seems like a very simple question, but it is in fact a very deeply complicated question. The science and technology of industrial agriculture, diet and nutrition, and food preparation are pervasive elements of our life. Right? We deal with them every day in one way or the other, although to many of us they are generally rather invisible. And in this series, we're going to look at several serious philosophical and ethical questions raised by those practices, those sciences, and those technological pursuits, including the practices of factory farming, the use of non-natural food additives, and the rather more recent process of genetically modified organisms used in the food supply, diet, health, and all of that. And that's what we're trying to explore in this series. I'm very glad that we have for you tonight a major figure in that area, as well as many others, Peter Singer. Peter Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University at their University Center for Human Values, as well as a laureate professor at the University of Melbourne. Peter Singer is the most influential and well-known philosopher of today, and one of the most significant contemporary public intellectuals, period. Professor Singer is in many ways the inheritor of the utilitarian tradition of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. In more ways than one, not only is his view a descendant of their views in some ways, but both Bentham and Mill were themselves public intellectuals who wanted to talk not just to philosophers and other thinkers, but to try to change public opinion and public practice. Professor Singer has been described in many different ways by different people. He's been described as controversial, dangerous, brutally frank, I like that one, kind, revolutionary, iconoclastic, as the architect of a culture of death, which I thought was a little, wow, and also as a man of compassion. He is well known for two now very important works in applied ethics. One, Animal Liberation, published in 1975. The other, Practical Ethics, published in 1979, recently received a second edition. His more recent work includes The Life You Can Save, the book and the related organization that fights poverty, Rethinking Life and Death, and a co-authored book with a similar title, The Ethics of What We Eat, right? A familiar title. Professor Singer's work is based in an idea, as he says, it's based in an idea that clarity and consistency of thinking about morality, of moral thinking, will in the long run lead to better ethical beliefs and actions. And I'm sure that we're going to get some clarity and consistency tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Singer.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here and get the chance to speak to you about this very important topic, and also to see such a full house. And in fact, hello to those of you in the overflow room, even an overflowing full house. So that's great, because this is a really important topic. When we think about ethics today, probably food is not the first thing that comes to most people's minds. There might be a range of different things. There might be things like ethics in government, bribery and corruption. A lot of people think of sex when they think of ethics. That's another set of issues. Perhaps people think about the other issue that Matt mentioned that I've written about, global poverty and what do we owe to the poor. But this is not necessarily, as I say, the first thing that would come to your mind. But it is a really important ethical issue, because nothing has changed the land surface of our planet as much as the way we produce our food, as much as agriculture. That has been the dominant influence on that, and it's also, as you'll see, a huge influence on tens of billions of animals. So something that affects that many animals has got to be ethically significant. And it does tie in with global poverty as well, and also clearly it's increasingly connected with climate change. So there's a whole range of important ethical issues that all come back to the food choices that we make. And that's why this is such an important ethical issue, and it's important really to be thinking about it. So what food choices do we make? Well, there's a range here of possible choices that we could make. Firstly, what is referred to often as the standard American diet, which I'm sure you're familiar with, whether you follow it yourself or not. You see it around pretty much everywhere. It's a diet that is heavy in animal products, in meat and eggs and dairy, and as we'll see, has a particular burden on the planet for that reason. It's also a diet that's come increasingly under pressure because of its health implications, although that's not an aspect that I'm going to deal with. I'm looking at the broader ethical impact that we have on others by our choices rather than the impact we have on ourselves. I don't want to say that's not an ethical question. It is, but I just don't have time to do it all, and honestly, I'm not particularly expert in the health issues. That's not my background. Then some other choices here. Vegetarian, avoiding meat but eating eggs and dairy. Vegan, avoiding all animal products. Organic, which I'll talk about just towards the end of what I say. Some people think it's more ethical to buy local, and you've probably seen fair trade labels on items like coffee and tea, and that raises an ethical question too about whether it's preferable to buy these products. So let's have a look at some of these issues. These, I think, are the three issues that I am going to talk about. So I mentioned the impact on animals that our food choices have, and as Matt mentioned, I have been writing about that for something like 40 years now. So this is an issue that I think is really important. The environmental impact and the connection with global poverty will be the three major topics that I'm going to focus on. Okay, so here is a basic argument against buying factory farmed products. I take it you're reasonably familiar with that term nowadays. That is, the products from animals kept intensively, in cases of chickens and pigs, indoors, in the case of cattle, intensively reared in a feedlot, where they're fed on grain. But I'm focusing particularly on that at the moment. This is the source of the overwhelming majority of animal products that are produced in the United States. So this is a basic argument. We start with this ethical premise that we shouldn't cause pain without a good reason. And I think most people, when you think about that, will accept that. And most people are against cruelty to animals, certainly where it's inflicted wantonly. If you have incidents like dogfighting, for example, you remember perhaps the outcry that greeted the news that the footballer Michael Vick was involved in dogfighting. So I think nobody thought that that was defensible. So that's a case of causing pain without good enough reason. So The second premise is a factual premise. I'll show you a little bit, I think, to illustrate this as I go along about different species, but I'm going to claim that animals do suffer in modern meat production. Another factual premise is that we could nourish ourselves in other ways, and I think that's indisputable since there are many people who are nourishing themselves in other ways. Not eating any factory farm products, in the case of vegans, not eating any animal products at all. Now, the next premise then is an ethical claim again. That is the claim that the fact that we like the way meat tastes or the way that the other animal products taste is not a good enough reason to justify the amount of suffering that animals are made to endure. So if there is significant suffering, then the question is, can things that are just a matter of taste, if it's not necessary for our survival, our good nutrition, our health, can that justify inflicting significant suffering on animals? And if I'm right that there is significant suffering, then I think the conclusion follows that we're not justified in doing this. And that, if it were accepted by the population of the United States or populations around the world generally, would make a very dramatic difference to the way we produce our food and to what we eat. So this is really the question, whether we can defend it in terms of views about how we're entitled to treat animals. So there are a variety of views that I'm going to mention. As Matt mentioned, I myself follow a utilitarian way of thinking about right and wrong. That is, that we ought to do what will have the best consequences for all of those affected, essentially for all sentient beings. But I want to point out that there are other traditions that I think can also support the kinds of things that I'm saying. And here is a statement made by Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, which also objects to factory farming, not in the way that I'm doing it, but from his own religious tradition of the idea that these are living creatures, that they're God's creatures, and that we're treating them in a way that effectively deforms their nature, and he says contradicts the relationship of mutuality that comes across in the Bible. I think it's excellent that Cardinal Ratzinger said these things. I rather wish that Pope Benedict XVI had said them as well. I think it might have had more impact. And I'm still hopeful that since his successor took the name of Francis, and we associate Francis not only with concern about poverty, but also with concern about animals, I'm hopeful that he will at one point say something about the ethics of this, the way we're treating animals today. I think that would make an important difference. Another important issue about this, before I get into the descriptions of what happens, is that most Americans do not know how their food is raised. And this is a quote from somebody who is actually teaching animal science. He's teaching, in other words, people who are going into the industry. He's not an animal rights activist. He's not even a philosopher. He's somebody who has a background in animal science, who knows animal production extremely well. That's his expertise, and is acknowledging that the people who consume the products of what he's teaching are largely ignorant about how they're produced. And if they were to know more about it, he particularly focuses on broilers, on chicken productions, if they could see how the birds were raised and harvested, then some of them, perhaps many of them, would swear off eating chicken and perhaps all meat. Now that in itself, I think, is a serious ethical situation, that the majority of Americans are engaged in doing something that they don't really know very much about, and in particular, they don't know one of the things that is really ethically relevant to what they're doing. That is, what it does to the animals that they're consuming. So I think to not know about things that you're involved in, that you're supporting by spending your dollars, is itself ethically suspect. So let's have a little quick look you perhaps are better informed than the typical Americans, and you may already know some of this, but let's have a quick look at some of these forms of production. So here's the broiler chicken shed, typical that Peter Cheek was talking about. As you see, it's a vast shed. It's really like a hangar. It's got perhaps 20,000 birds in it, so that when you look at it, that's really, you're looking at like a carpet of white, the birds. The food and water comes down these lines that you can see that go through the shed. The first thing, if you ever walk into one of these sheds, the first thing you'll notice, in fact, is not just the birds, but the air. The air is full of ammonia. It's full of ammonia because the droppings of these 20,000 birds have been there not only for the lifetime of those birds, which is actually quite short, as I'll tell you in a minute, but for flocks of birds before that have been reared and taken out and killed and so on. They clean out these sheds perhaps once a year. So you've got a huge amount of bird droppings sitting there. There are fans ventilating it, there have to be, but even so, the ammonia in the air is very unpleasant. You feel it just walking into the shed, and the birds have to live with it. Another problem is, as I said, the birds are not there very long because they've been bred to come to market weight quicker and quicker. That's been the emphasis on the breeding. So it's now 42 days from hatching to the market weight that birds are in the supermarket. So these are really babies. They're 6 weeks old. One of the consequences of the fact that they grow so fast, they put on so much weight, is that their bones may not be mature enough to support that weight. So it's relatively common that a bird's legs will just collapse under it as it gets near the point at which it's ready to be marketed. And there's no individual attention to these birds. They're just not worth it. 20,000 birds in a shed, you don't pay somebody to look at each bird. So if the bird's legs collapse under it, it just has to stay wherever it is. And if it's not within reach of one of those pipes that supply food and water, it dies of thirst or of hunger. And that happens in any flock like this. You'll find birds, when they're pulled out, that are dead on the floor. Some of them might have been there for days. Somebody will occasionally walk through the shed and pull out the corpses. But there is no individual attention to the well-being of the birds at all. And when they are caught, a common method is that you have people just walking in and grabbing them by one leg, holding them upside down, because they grab as many as they can. They want to do this as quickly as they can. This is not a very attractive way of earning an income, so it attracts people who have to do that. They're often undocumented immigrants, and essentially, they can't really do the job. They can't be very concerned about the well-being of the birds. So they may break the bird's legs again just by the way they're carrying a bunch of birds in one hand, and then they shove them in the cages, which goes on the back of the truck, and they're off to the slaughtering plant. So there's another shot just from the bird's eye view of showing you how densely packed they are. And the situation of the birds that lay eggs, is no better. In some ways, it's worse because they don't have the room to move around. As you can see here, they're in cages. I've got another shot of them there. They're very packed together, so that even if you had one bird in one of these cages, they wouldn't be able to stretch their wings fully. But in fact, you will often have 4, 5, or 6 birds in a cage. So they're extremely crowded. In a normal farmyard flock, you will get some birds that are more aggressive, more dominant than others, and the birds all learn that, and they can move out of the way of the aggressive birds. So they, nothing too much happens. But if they're all in a cage, they can't move out of the way. So the result is that birds peck each other, and to stop this, the producers don't try and deal with the causes of this aggression, which of course is overcrowding. They cut off the end of the bird's beak with a hot knife, which is a very painful procedure for the bird because a hen's beak it's not like your fingernails. They have a lot of nerves in that. That's how the hen relates to the ground. That's how she detects whether something on the ground is edible or is not edible. So it's a painful procedure, and it's done to prevent aggression. If you look at this bird, you'll see this is a bird at the end of lay, an extremely lucky bird, who was bought by an animal welfare organization and for the first time gets out on grass. Now the first thing you'll notice about her is she hardly has any feathers. She's completely got lots of pink skin around the rump and the neck, and the feathers are moved from the wings. That's could be because she's been feather pecked by a more aggressive bird, or it could be because she's just been rubbing against the wire. She's been pushed against the wire. She's been in a wire cage for a year, maybe even 18 months, and never been out of it. Now, for the first time in her life, she's out on grass. And the interesting thing is, she's still a reasonably normal hen. That is, she's still, as soon as she gets out, she starts chasing insects across the grass. When it's time for her to lay an egg, she tries to go to a sheltered area, a kind of nesting area. She'll try and build up a nest with bits of grass or straw or something like that. All of her basic instincts, which have been thwarted for her entire life up to that point, are still there. Okay, let's look at pig production. These are gestation crates for sows. These are pregnant sows. They're the breeders of the pigs that are sent to market. So this is essentially a breeding machine. That's her role in the factory farming system. She's made pregnant, and when she's pregnant, she's put in these individual stalls. Got another view of them here so you can see. These ones are on bare concrete. Some of them are on, I think I've got one more, are on slats. You can see how little space they have. All they can do is stand up and lie down. They can't turn around. The stall is too narrow, and there's nowhere to walk. They're put like that because it's an easy way to manage them, to make sure that each one gets the right amount of food. The floor is either concrete or slatted because you can just hose away the feces and urine. You don't have the labor of bringing in straw, which would give us something to play with or something to bed down on, but costs more to bring it in. And so, as I say, essentially she's a breeding machine. She's got pregnant. She's like this when she's pregnant. Then when she actually gives birth, she doesn't have any more room either. This is what's called a farrowing crate. She's held in this contraption so that now she becomes a milking machine for her piglets. She never gets the chance to really look after them as she would. If she had space, if she was able to build a nest of straw, which pigs would do, she would gather the pigs around her. She would be licking them or touching them. She can't really do that. She's just held in this device. And as soon as the pigs can be weaned from her, and they're taken from her quite early, because as long as she's nursing the pigs like that, you can't get her pregnant again. So they take the pigs from the piglets as early as they can, put them in a separate place where I'll show you. And after about 8 days, which are perhaps the only time in her life when she does have room to walk around, she's made pregnant again, and she's put back in the stalls. And that will go on for a few cycles, and probably at the age of about 3 or so, the producer will decide that it's not worth breeding her anymore. She won't have as many piglets. She'll still be able to reproduce, but she won't have as big a litter, and so she'll be slaughtered, and more sows will be brought in to go through the same procedure. So this is what happens to her offspring. They're also reared indoors. They do have a little bit more room. They're in group pens, but they never get outside to walk around a field or anything like that either. This is intensive cattle production. Certainly cattle do have more space, as you can see here. They can walk around. And they've not been like this all their lives. They're usually about the first 8 months with their mothers on grass, which is a reasonable sort of existence. And then they're brought to the feedlots for the last 6 months for fattening, where they'll be fed mostly on grain. One of the problems here, though, is that, and you can probably perhaps see it not too far from here, I would think, they've got no protection from either sun in century-plus days in summer or from freezing weather in winter. And there have been studies done which show that if you provide shade in parts of the country where it gets pretty hot, if you provide shade, you actually do save some of your cattle. That is, there are cattle that die in heat waves, which will not die if you provide them with shade. Now you might think, well, cattle are valuable animals, why wouldn't the farmers provide the shade? And the reason is explained in the article, that the return on the cost of building the shade is not justified by the additional number of cattle you bring to market. You do bring more cattle to market, but you don't make up for the cost of providing the shade. So that's basically, it's pure economics. There's no concern for the welfare of the animals independently of the economics of how you produce them. This is fortunately on the way out. I think this is intensive veal production. Again, individual stalls, rather like the pigs. Young veal calves taken from their mothers at an early age and reared on a milk replacer diet to make their flesh pale and soft and fetch a higher price for it. In animal liberation, I had quite a lot about this. It was really the dominant, perhaps virtually the only way of producing veal in the United States. But I'm pleased to say that this is one area in which a lot more Americans have become aware of the problems, the ethical problems of veal production. And as a result of that pressure, the American Veal Producers Association has itself said that producers should move away from individual stalls to group housing of veal calves. So although this still exists, I think it's definitely on the decline now. And finally, since Thanksgiving is coming up, I thought I'd show you some turkey production. It's actually, in this respect, very like chicken production. A huge shed, you can't quite see it all here, but a huge shed, very densely crowded with turkeys. And again, they're not really thought of as individuals in standard factory farm turkey production. There is one significant difference between turkey production and chicken production. Turkeys, as many of you will have noticed, have been bred to have very large breasts. This is what the what the consumer wants, and therefore the producers provide it, more of that white meat. But this is a problem. Male turkeys cannot physically mate. They cannot physically mate with a female turkey because of the way they've been bred. So how is it that we have more turkeys each Thanksgiving? There's the answer. Every one of the standard factory farm turkeys is the result of artificial insemination. So there are workers like these. Well, actually two different. These are the workers who are putting the semen into the female turkey. Obviously, before that, there have been other workers who grab the male turkeys and masturbate them and collect the semen. As Matt mentioned, I've written a book with the same title as this lecture, The Ethics of What We Eat. My co-author in that, Jim Mason, decided to see what this was like for a day. So he got a job. He said this was the hardest, dirtiest, and most unpleasant day's work he's ever done. It's not difficult to get a job because there's a high turnover, as you might expect, and it's not well paid either. But again, these people, as with all of these animal industries, the pressure is on poorly paid workers to get through as many birds as quickly as possible, whether it's picking up the chickens for market or the turkeys, whether it's on the slaughter lines, or whether it's artificially inseminating. So they are there to do hundreds of birds an hour. And so obviously they can't be gentle with them. They have to grab them quickly. The female turkeys and the breeding turkeys know about this. They've been through it before generally. So they struggle, they resist, but they have to be grabbed and handled and be inseminated. Okay, so I think that I've made a case, so I'll come to this slide in a moment. I think that I've made a case that there is significant suffering in factory farming, and that, as I say, the fact that some people may like the taste of animal products cannot justify this ethically. Now, if that's so, if I've persuaded you of that, then I think that, as I said, is a really important point, because this is the dominant way of producing meat eggs. I haven't talked about dairy particularly, but a significant amount of dairy as well in this country. But you might say, well, okay, isn't there an alternative? This is a quote from a British philosopher, Roger Scruton, who thinks that although he agrees that you cannot defend factory farming, he thinks this does not mean that you ought to be a vegetarian or vegan. He thinks you can defend something called conscientious omnivorism. He thinks that if we treat animals with respect, we don't inflict suffering on them. He even uses the terms demands of sympathy and piety, then that's justified. And he starts out with the idea, I guess, that these animals would not exist but for us, so they depend on us, and if they have good lives, then is there something wrong with that? Well, I think there is a possibility of that. This is an alternative to the egg production methods that I showed you before. This is a farm not far from Princeton in New Jersey that produces eggs. It's an organic farm. Not all organic farms, I should say, are as good as this, though. But as you can see, the birds are outside on grass. They have a shed, which you may notice is on wheels. In the evening, they're put into the shed and locked up there. That protects them from foxes, but also it means they'll lay their eggs there in nesting boxes, and then they'll be let out after they've laid and the eggs can be collected. So it certainly can be done. It's not as if it's paradise for the hens, because they're still going to be killed when their rate of lay drops off, which is long before the end of their natural lifespan. So they're still there, commercially to produce eggs. But admittedly, I think if kept like this, hens have decent lives. And so that's something that I think is vastly more defensible than what I've been showing you. And if you think that, if you agreed with me, that what I've shown you before is indefensible, but if you can't face, let's say, the idea of going without eggs, then finding an egg supplier like this is definitely an ethically preferable option to simply continuing to buy the products of factory farming. And to some extent, those conditions can be found with the other animal products, although it's not always easy to do so. Okay, so that's essentially the point that I want to make about the impact of food choices on animals. Let's say a little bit about the environmental impacts that we're talking about. So one question is what happens to the animal wastes? And this has become a major problem in terms of water pollution. This is a typical factory farm which pumps water out into what in the industry is known as a lagoon. When I think of the word lagoon, I tend to think of those tropical islands surrounded by a coral reef with a sparkling blue water in them. This is a rather different sort of lagoon. It's actually, I guess, a very large cesspit, and you don't want to get too near them for the smell. Here's an aerial view of a very large pig farm. So the hogs, you see, there's 9,000 hogs per site, these rows of sheds, and there's more up there and off the picture and so on. So, and the manure goes out into these, these shallow retaining lagoon where the manure sits before being sprayed on the surrounding fields. So what's the problem with this? It looks like it's okay, it's reusing the manure on the fields. There are a number of problems. One is that the lagoons typically are not built to withstand extreme climate events. And as you may have noticed, we get extreme climate events now and again, and then the lagoons will often overflow or break down, and you will get this manure going into the rivers, and you get often fish killed for miles downstream. So that's one of the significant causes of the huge amount of water pollution and river pollution that has happened across America in the last 50 years. Anybody who lived in the countryside, an older person, is likely to be able to tell you that when they were a kid, they used to be able to go swimming in the river, and now nobody would go swimming in the river. It's too polluted. And so this is one of the, it's not the only cause. Of course, there's also, in some places, there's industrial pollution of water, but this is one of the very significant causes of this. Even if the lagoons hold and they don't break, as it says, manure is being sprayed on surrounding fields, but because manure is a bulky thing, hard to move around, it tends to be sprayed relatively close to where it's produced and over-concentrated on those fields. So you get runoff from the fields into the rivers. And so that's a further pollution problem. So that's a kind of relatively local problem with pollution, although it doesn't have to be that local. I mean, pollution from the Midwest ends up in the Mississippi, flows down to the Gulf of Mexico, and creates these large dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's more than local. But there's another aspect as well that I want to talk to you about. You've seen this slide before, of course, from the point of view of the animal welfare aspect of it. A different aspect of this is that this concentration of cattle like this is a huge methane producer. So methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It's generally regarded as being 27 times as powerful as carbon dioxide in terms of its contribution to global warming. And although the quantities produced are not the same, it's a major reason as to why the livestock industry is a big factor in climate change. So here's a calculation that's been done by a couple of scientists looking at the relationship between various things that we do and our contributions to climate change. So many people, if you think, I'm concerned about climate change, I'd like to reduce my carbon footprint, what will I do? You might think, maybe I'll get one of those hybrids. Maybe I'll swap my car for a Prius, for instance. And if you do that, you will reduce your footprint. Here's an example. So from the average typical American car to a fuel-efficient hybrid, you're going to save 1 ton of carbon per year, which is a significant part of your carbon footprint. But there's another change that you could make that would actually do even more good. If you switch from the typical American diet, which, as I've said, is high in animal products and particularly in beef, to a vegan diet with the same number of calories, you actually save 1.5 tons of carbon per year. So the meat diet makes a bigger contribution than the kind of car that you drive. Here's the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, which generally is an organization that's concerned to promote and improve agriculture, but it has become concerned about the greenhouse gas contributions of agriculture. They did a study a few years back called Livestock's Long Shadow, in which they said that the livestock sector generates more greenhouse gases than the whole of the transport sector, than all of the cars we drive, all of the planes that are flying, as well as the trucks and trains and ships. Livestock is contributing more. It's second only to stationary energy generation, to power generation, in other words. So that's another real ethical problem about the choices that we make. And this is one area in which moving away from factory farming, but at least in the case of the beef production, doesn't really help. Here's a study that compared the greenhouse gas emissions of cattle reared entirely on grass. You often see places advertising grass-fed beef as if that were better, and it is better for the animals, I think. They're better off on grass. It's a diet more naturally suited to the way their stomachs work. but it's not better for the environment as far as climate change is concerned. They're at least 50% more carbon intensive than grain-fed cattle. Now you might wonder, why is that? Well, the reason is essentially the same reason why producers take cattle off grass and put them in feedlots. They fatten up more quickly on grain. Grain is a more energy-intensive food, and they put on weight more quickly. So think about the reverse of that. They have to live longer to reach a given weight, to reach the market weight, or if you like, you can think of it, for each pound of beef that's produced, they have to be there longer, eating grass longer, and also grass they have to digest. They have these special stomachs to digest grass, but that's where the methane is generated in the digestion process. So basically, more cattle digestion has gone into producing the pound of grass-fed beef than the pound of grain-fed beef. So even if you take into account the greenhouse gases produced in the grain production, you still find that there is more, it's more carbon intensive to have cattle on grass than beef. So unfortunately, although this is a better way of producing them from an animal welfare point of view, it's a worse way from climate change. Now, many Americans who are concerned about climate change make the move to eating locally. They think, well, it's a waste to transport food around the country. They've read figures showing that food is moved enormous distances in the United States. It's part of the marketing distribution system of supermarkets. Sometimes it seems quite irrational that food will be trucked in a long way to some large depot that the supermarket chain has, and then trucked out again hundreds of miles. And so people will think, well, this is a bad thing from the point of view of climate change, all of these trucks moving around the country. I'm going to buy locally. Well, other things being equal, buying locally is good. Supports your local farmers, does reduce food miles, but actually the switch to a vegetarian diet saves a lot more, as this slide shows, than going locally, because the more of the greenhouse gas emissions are in the production when we're talking about production of animal foods. And again, it's particularly the ruminants, which means cattle and sheep, I suppose, but we don't eat nearly as much lamb as we eat beef. So it's particularly the ruminants that are the worst offenders as far as the greenhouse gases are concerned. Okay, so the third of the topics that, as I said, I want to talk about is the issue of global poverty. Now remember the feedlot that I showed, the cattle feedlot, again, those cattle obviously are not eating grass. The chickens are not eating grass, or grains, or sorry, not eating insects or something like that. And the pigs also are having to be fed. So we are feeding vast amounts of grain now to animals. The great majority of US grain production is going to animals. Brazil has become the world's biggest exporter of soybeans. The majority of the Brazilian soybean crop is being fed to animals. And essentially, when we do this, we are wasting the majority of the food value that we have there. That grain or those soybeans represents a lot of food. When we channel it through animals, it's as if we're feeding a fuel into some kind of machine that will convert it into something else. You think of the animal as a machine that converts grain and soy into meat or eggs or dairy. But in all of these cases, it gives us less back than we put in. It has to. It can't avoid doing that because the animal has to burn energy just to keep its body warm. For instance, so that's one reason. Then it's going to develop things like bone or maybe some internal organs that we're not going to eat. That takes food energy, has to be converted to that as well. So we get only a small fraction of what we put in out at the end. And beef cattle, in fact, are the worst, but typically we get far more food value from the plant products. This slide is a little old, and I couldn't find a similar one recently, but I don't think the figures have changed that much. The ratios may have changed a little bit. But if you look at this, we're talking about usable protein per acre from different foods, and it's a USDA study. So you see it's the plant foods that are over on the left at the high end of the graph, starting with soy, which of course is a very high protein plant food. And then we get, and we're talking about protein here, not about just about calories, even with rice and corn or legumes or wheat, not particularly high protein foods, but we still get more protein per acre than any of the animal products until we start getting down to the animal products, the milk, eggs, meat in general, and beef. So it's not an efficient form of production. And if anybody ever tries to defend factory farming by saying, well, yes, it's not very nice to the animals, it's not great for the environment, but we've got a growing population, we have to feed them, that's essentially a complete load of bunkum. We are wasting food by doing this. If we want to feed a growing population, we will not channel these foods which we can already eat, put them through animals, and get only a small amount of the protein, or for that matter, even less smaller amount of the calories of the food value that we're putting in. Okay, sorry, one further thing that I should have said about the previous slide is this has ramifications, obviously, for world food production. So because we produce so much of the, because we consume so much of the grains and soybeans, world food prices are higher than they otherwise would be. And although in general the world has made some progress over the last 20 or 30 years in reducing the proportion of the world's population that is living in extreme poverty, in terms of the number of people who are undernourished, which basically means they're not getting enough calories, and they're hungry for at least part of the year, there are a lot of these people who have to buy food and simply don't have enough income to get enough calories. Now, they're very sensitive to increases in the price of food that can be imported. And some of these poorer countries are food importing countries. So when food prices rise, more of them go hungry. There was recently been objections to using corn to create ethanol because it said that contributes to food price rises in developing countries. And we're putting something like 100 million tons of grain into ethanol. But in fact, we're putting about 7 times that amount of grain and soybeans into animals and getting, as I said, maybe on average a quarter or a fifth of the food value out of it. So we waste much more grain through livestock production, and that contributes more to high prices of food and therefore does contribute to more people going hungry. So that's one connection with food and global poverty. Another connection here is the terms of trade on which we're dealing with people in poverty. The fair trade movement started because in a number of developing countries, crops like coffee are produced by small peasant growers. And they might do all right when the price of coffee is high, but the price of coffee fluctuates from year to year, depending on how good the crops are in particular large coffee producers. So these peasant farmers then are thrown into poverty by a fall in coffee prices and can't feed their families and may actually be starving or have to go into cities and abandon their places and try and find work in the cities. So the Fair Trade Organization was started to guarantee a minimum price for agricultural products from developing countries. To say, we will enter into a long-term agreement with you to take your coffee and pay you a minimum livable wage. So we calculate how much you need to live on, for your family to live on, and we'll make sure that we pay you enough per pound to do that. And if the price rises above, well, we'll pay you the going price. But if the price falls below that minimum wage, you will still get that minimum wage. And they also encouraged the small producers to form cooperatives and to put some of the returns from the coffee into projects that benefit the entire community. So it's not just going to individuals, but it's, for example, helping them to get safe drinking water in the village. So that's what fair trade really started with. It started with coffee, but it's now spread to a lot of other products. These are some of the main ones, but in fact, worldwide, there are now hundreds of fair trade products. And you'll see this label, or a slightly different label that's sometimes used in the US, as an indication that the products are being bought on those terms. So I think that's another way in which our food choices can actually make an impact in helping some of the world's poorest people, and I think that's a worthwhile and ethical food choice to make. Just briefly, I want to say something about organic production. What are some reasons why we might think that it's better to buy organic production, although organic products are more expensive? Obviously, one reason many people buy it is because they think it's better for their health. And again, that's something I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to look at some of the other reasons why it might be better for the country or the world as a whole. So one reason would be the nature of the herbicides or pesticides that are used. It's not that organic producers cannot use any herbicides or pesticides, but they can only use ones which generally have been long use and well understood, usually natural products, and understood to be safe, and not only safe for us, but to have not to have a seriously harmful effect on the environment as a whole. Another factor is that genetically modified plants or animals can't be certified as organic. Now, yeah, I'm not going to say a lot about this. I think this is a subject that perhaps would need a lecture in itself. There are certainly some reasons for concern about genetically modified plants and animals. One of those is that genetically modified plants may cross with wild species, and it's been conjectured that because we confer resistance to certain pests on genetically modified plants, or we make them more resistant to frost, if that gets into a native plant, it may turn it into a weed because the natural restrictions on its spreading may have been removed by the new genes that it's adopted by crossing with the genetically modified organism. But so far, there's no documented cases of that happening. That is, there are documented cases of genetically modified crops crossing with natural crops, with natural plants, that does happen, but of this creating any kind of superweed that has caused anything to go out of balance. So at the moment, I'd have to say you'd want to be careful about that. You'd perhaps want to have careful studies about whether this can happen and whether it's likely to produce problems, but so far it doesn't seem to have done so. Then a lot of people are concerned about health risks. Again, I don't think the evidence is really clear that genetically modified organisms do cause human health problems. That's not a statement that everybody would agree with. I know there are some studies that do suggest hazards, but as with many of these studies, they're not really very carefully controlled, so you can't really be sure that the GMO organisms were the problems here. So my position at the moment is to keep an open mind on this, certainly to be cautious, but not to say that it's clear that genetically modified products ought not to be allowed. Because on the other side, there are potential benefits from genetically engineering products. For example, I've talked about climate change. Climate change is going to produce higher temperatures in some regions. It's going to produce less reliable rainfall. If we can produce plants that can withstand heat and drought better than existing plants, that could be extremely useful for enabling us to continue to grow crops in areas where we couldn't. And perhaps in some parts of the world, that is going to mean a difference between whether people can stay in their land or whether they are going to have to become refugees because of changing climate patterns. So I think that, as I say, we ought to keep an open mind and look at GMOs on a case-by-case basis to see if we can tell what the risks are and what the benefits might be. Okay, organically grown feed without antibiotics, steroids, or hormones. Again, a lot of people will prefer to eat those products anyway, but there are also environmental benefits because steroids, for example, which are typically fed to animals like those cattle that you saw, they're fed steroids because it helps them put on muscle, just as it helps athletes put on muscle, helps cattle put on muscle, and more muscle means more saleable meat. So those animals are likely to be fed steroids. They urinate part of them out, and that's washed by the rains into the rivers. And you can detect steroids in rivers. And in one study that was done in Nebraska, there were changes in fish as a result of the steroids. This is a species of fish where the males and females normally look quite different. And because of the hormones in the water, the differences between males and females were significantly reduced as a result of the runoff. So there's definitely environmental problems with that, and organic is better in that way. And finally, from an animal welfare point of view, as I said, it's not going to be those kinds of factory farming that I showed you, but sometimes the rules about animals being able to go outdoors are not observed or observed in a very tokenistic form. So, for example, chickens might have not that lovely grass field that I showed you, but a small patch of dirt where they can go outside, where there's essentially nothing much for them to do. There's no grass, there's no insects, there's nothing like that. If no food is out there, they're not very interested in staying out there. So I don't think the standards are really as good as they should be. I think the Department of Agriculture, which ultimately sets the standards, has been unduly influenced by the really big organic producers, and therefore what you might see if you go and visit a small organic farm is not necessarily what you're getting when you go to the supermarket and you buy something that's labeled organic. Okay, so getting to the conclusion, these are the things that I'd like you to take away. As I say, I've used there that abbreviation, confined animal feeding operation. That's an industry term for factory farming. So I think the clearest conclusion I'd like you to take away is that it's not ethically acceptable to buy products from factory farming, animal products from factory farming. That's all the industries need to continue to do what they're doing. If you buy those products, you're supporting it. I think that it is ethically indefensible. I think it clearly makes animals suffer, and it makes them suffer, as I said, just because we enjoy the taste. To go back to the example of dog fighting, if it's not justified to inflict suffering on dogs because you enjoy the spectacle of watching them fight each other, I don't think it's justified to inflict the suffering on chickens or pigs or any other animals in order to enjoy the taste of their flesh. And although the suffering of dogs in dogfight might be much more acute for the minutes that they're fighting, I think the suffering of those pigs or hens over months or years is probably worse than the suffering that dogs experience in dogfighting. So that's, as I say, the strongest conclusion that I like to argue for. I think we should avoid beef to reduce its impact on climate change, which I do see as one of the great moral challenges that face us in the century to come. And although I haven't really defended a vegetarian and vegan diet really in this talk, but I'm happy to if we get any questions or discussion to say more about that, I think it's preferable diet to be vegetarian or vegan, or if you don't want to do that, to at least be a conscientious omnivore who's aware of the source of the animal products and concerned about the welfare of the animals while they're alive. I think it's preferable to buy fair trade products and to, if you can afford it, to buy organic rather than non-organic where that is available. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to some questions and some discussion. Thank you.
Okay, as I said, if you have questions, you should have cards that you picked up on the way in. Please write your question down on a card. If you don't have a card, maybe someone next to you has a card or a piece of paper that you can write it on. If you're over in the overflow room, you should have cards there too, and the ushers will come and collect and bring your cards to us, so you can also join us. So just take a moment to collect. While we wait, I'll exercise the privilege and ask a question of my own.
Please.
So there's in making individual choices as well as doing things like voting, there's sometimes a sort of paradoxical feeling like what I do as an individual doesn't matter very much one way or the other on the impact of the larger system. You know, if I vote in Texas, Green Party or Libertarian or whatever, it's not going to matter very much one way or the other on the final outcome. If I buy this kind of food or that kind of food, the factory farms are not going to go away. So I wonder what you think about the relative importance of individual decisions and sort of policy or larger sort of social processes.
Okay, that's a good question. I have focused really on your individual choices. And there's a reason why I do that. In a way, I think we have two ways of voting here. We can vote at the ballot box, and we can vote at the checkout. We can vote with our dollars. And I think, given the nature of the political system on this particular issue, I think voting with your dollars is actually more likely to make a difference. Voting with your dollars and perhaps also letting the corporations that you buy from know your opinion on these can be valuable as well. Let me take a minute or two to explain exactly why. So in terms of voting at the ballot box, I wouldn't say that it can never be useful. It has sometimes been useful where you have a possibility of a citizen-initiated referendum. And that has happened, and that has changed, or is in the process of changing factory farming in a few states in this country. So the most notable example was California in 2008, where animal rights advocates got on the ballot an initiative to require that all farm animals must be kept in such a way that they can stretch their limbs or turn around without touching either the side of their enclosure or another animal. Now, you saw the pictures that I've shown you. You realize that that is going to mean you can't have those laying hens in cages. You can't have those pigs in gestation crates. Probably you can't even have the pigs in the pigs that are sent to market in the not as tightly confined in those small pens. So that was passed in 2008. It was passed actually by a really big margin in California. So you might know, of course, California is a very strong state for Democratic presidential candidates lately. So it was no surprise at all that Barack Obama carried California by a big margin in 2008. It wasn't really, they didn't campaign very much there. But the initiative to ban those methods of keeping animals actually got a bigger majority in California in 2008 than Barack Obama did. So it passed by a really decisive margin. And that law is being phased in. I think it has a 7-year phase-in period. So it's not quite there yet, but hopefully there is an initiative actually in federal Congress at the moment to try to overturn it. Steve King of Iowa is trying to attach to the Farm Bill something that prohibits states setting their own regulations for animals, specifically to overturn that initiative. And I'm hoping that won't get through, but if it doesn't, then Californian animals will be much better off than most other animals in this country. So that's an example. But if you don't have that initiative system, it's really hard to get these things through the legislature, especially in the big farming states. So, you might be able to get something through the legislature. There's something that went through the state of New Jersey to prevent those gestation crates for sows. And it actually was passed by both houses of the New Jersey legislature, but it was vetoed by Governor Christie. Why did Governor Christie veto it? Well, a lot of people speculate that he vetoed it because Iowa is one of the biggest pig producing states in the country, and if you want to be president of the United States, it helps to do well in Iowa in the primary, right? So this is a very long answer to your question, Matt, I realize, but let me just finish. I think that the problem federally and in a lot of states that have a lot of animal production is that the industry has too much money. You're not really going to be able to fight it in Congress because I think we all know the American political system allows pretty much unrestricted campaign contributions from industries. And it's therefore very hard at the ballot box to fight these forms of farming. In other countries with different political systems, like the parliamentary democracies of Europe, there's actually been a lot more success. And a lot of these methods of keeping hens and pigs and so on have been prohibited through legislation. Okay.
So the prize for most popular question goes to, what about fish?
Okay, very good question. I'm glad it was asked. And again, it's another thing, this is a large topic, a large area, something that I left aside because of time constraints. So there are two ways of producing fish. The traditional way was you go and catch wild fish, of which the vast majority, of course, are caught out of the oceans. More recently, we've developed fish farming. So let me say a little bit about each of these things. When you catch wild fish, there's clearly no welfare problem in terms of anything up to the moment you catch them. They're just living their natural lives as they would have if we hadn't caught them. So that's an advantage over animals that we've produced domestically, where we have transformed the way they live in ways that are usually not good for them. On the other hand, when we catch wild fish, there is no humane method of killing them. I think it's pretty clear that fish can feel pain. They're vertebrates. They certainly behave as if they feel pain. And normally they die from suffocation. They're hauled up in nets into the air. They can't breathe in the air. They flap around for several minutes before they die from suffocation. Some deep sea fish that are hauled up out of the depths from trawlers die from decompression. They're brought up too fast out of the depths. They can't survive. And essentially their internal organs rupture because of decompression, which must also be a painful way to die. So I think the objection to wild-caught fish is simply that. It's the fact that there isn't a humane form of death. And the second objection to them is that we are overfishing the oceans. And a lot of fish stocks have collapsed. The great Atlantic cod fishery was the first one to go, which produced a huge amount of protein for both the eastern seaboard of the United States and for Europe for many centuries, from the 16th century onwards. In the mid-20th century, it started to get overfished, and it's gone, and it has not recovered, although fishing has stopped there. And we're selectively doing that to other fish stocks. So there's a real problem of overfishing, and it's particularly a problem that does exacerbate some poverty issues where we fish outside the coastal limits of developing countries. because the fish don't observe the coastal limits and they move in and out. And so coastal villagers who used to get lots of fish and therefore could get a decent diet now find that the fish are gone because they're all being scooped up by international fishing fleets, which of course sell them to the countries that can pay for them, the United States, Europe, and so on, and it's food removing from people who are poor. So those are the two issues with wild-caught fish. With aquaculture, a lot of this is carnivorous fish. Okay? So for example, farmed salmon are carnivorous fish. So it's basically the same problem that you have when you feed grain to pigs or cattle. You have to catch fish to feed the salmon. So the trawlers go out and they catch wild fish, ones that don't have much commercial value for humans, by feeding them to humans, and then they feed them to the salmon. And again, the salmon waste a lot of the food value. So probably we have to catch twice as much fish, churn it into fish meal or fish pellets, and feed it to the salmon. So that's not a good form of producing food either. If you have fish that are herbivorous fish, there is a bit of that happens, and that's fish farmed, and they're eating grass crops or something like that. Well then, okay, maybe you do produce more food what we can eat. So maybe that's better. But again, there are animal welfare questions about fish farming, and we don't know really enough about fish to be able to tell whether they're stressed by the confinement and the overcrowding in fish farms or not.
Okay.
Okay.
A lot of people would like, this is potentially a very deep rabbit hole, but maybe you can do this sort of from 10,000 feet. Would like you to connect the dots from where you've gone in this talk to, say, veganism. Or on the sort of flip side of that question, do you think that it is ever permissible to kill animals even if they are humanely or organically or whatever reared or for any other purposes?
Okay. So, well, let me start perhaps with the veganism question. I think the vegan has the advantage of knowing, firstly, that you're not contributing to animal suffering because you're not consuming animals. I mean, you know, that's not to say that there's no animals will ever suffer when you grow crops. Of course they do, and some people will say, you know, well, look, when the crops are harvested, there are small rodents that get crushed by the harvester. So, you know, you can't be pure. And I think that's true. You know, none of us can go through life without being complicit in some kinds of harm. But from an ethical perspective, I don't think it's a matter of being pure. I think it's a matter of living in a way to minimize the amount of harm you do and maximize the amount of good you do. And I think the vegan typically is responsible for far less animal suffering than the non-vegan, even the conscientious omnivore. And also from the point of view of the environment, as I showed you with that slide, the vegan has a much lighter carbon footprint than even the conscientious omnivore who's consuming, let's say, grass-fed beef. So, yeah, I think in some ways it's an ideal diet, but that's not to say that, you know, in some way that everybody is under an obligation to switch to this immediately. I think for some people this is a big step. Some people tell me that they don't feel good on it. I think this may be a matter of some individual variation. Lots of people feel terrific on it, and lots of athletes and long distance, ultra long distance runners and so on who do very well on a vegan diet. I think somebody just broke the record for hiking the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico up to Canada on a vegan diet, so you can do well with it. But you know, I do occasionally get people in an audience who say, look, I tried being vegan, I really tried hard for several months, I just didn't feel good on it. So I don't think people should feel terrible if they don't move to that. I think they should reduce the amount of animal products that they consume. I think they should consume only animal products from places that really they've checked out the animal welfare credentials of, and I think they should minimize their carbon footprint by avoiding ruminant products, beef, and try to avoid dairy if you can as well. I think the free-range chicken and free-range eggs are better products, and maybe free-range eggs are probably, if you're going to eat some animal products, free-range eggs from a place like I showed you might be the most ethical way to eat. But, and this goes back to your other question, there's one other way to eat that actually, paradoxically, I think is more defensible than any of the things that most Americans do. This is a question that I sometimes get asked around Princeton. In Princeton, we have a lot of deer. And of course, we've removed the natural predators of the deer. There are no more wolves, there are no more Native Americans who are killing the deer. And in fact, the main predator, if you call it that, of deer in Princeton is the motor vehicle. People hit them at night. It's not good for the deer, and it's often not good for their vehicles. So, but even if they didn't, even if they weren't killing them on the roads, they die off in winter because the population is at a level where in winter there's just really not enough food to support them. And that's not a very pleasant death, I think. They're dying of starvation in winter. So suppose that in this situation, you're a good shot and you go out with a gun and you're good enough to be able to kill a deer instantly with your first bullet. I think that's, and you then eat the venison. I think that's a more ethical way to eat, to get meat than anything that you can, pretty much anything you can get at the supermarket. Because you do, although people might say, well, you're still killing this animal, it would have lived. Yes, it would have lived for a while, but either it or some other animal would have then starved to death a little bit later if the hunting season is in October or November and the deer perhaps would have died in January. So I don't think that that's a terrible difference that you're making to the deer. So I think there can be certainly circumstances where you could justify living in that way. The animal has had a perfectly natural life that you've not interfered with. It's died painlessly. And I think that that's something which, this is a more complicated philosophical issue, but I think that, I'm not saying, I never have argued, that when it comes to killing, humans and animals are equal. I don't think that. I think that typically humans with the capacities that they have to think about their lives, to relate to others, to plan their lives for the future, I think do have more to lose if they're killed than an animal that doesn't have the same sort of sense of its own existence over time. And that's why I think it can be justifiable to kill an animal in circumstances where it would certainly not be justifiable to kill a human.
So several people have sort of very hypothetical questions, which I think are meant to tease out what exactly is the basis of the animal welfare argument. So three of these out of the set that I got were, one, what if it was possible to, genetically engineer or to anesthetize the animals so that they didn't suffer no matter what we did to them? One of them is, what if we kind of what if we managed to overcome all of the environmental issues and poverty issues? And the third is, what about extending your argument to the harms caused by plants, right? to plants, moving from like a vegetarianism to a fruitarianism, something like that. So I think all of those try to tease out sort of the basis of the argument.
Okay, so the basis of the argument, if that's what you're trying to tease out, is essentially avoiding suffering. And the flip side of that is if they're going to be animals around, to try to make their lives as good as possible. So it's avoiding pain and misery and suffering, promoting enjoyment of life, basically. But I'm more focused in this discussion, I guess, about pain and suffering. So take the last of these, plants. I don't believe that plants can suffer. I don't think there's any evidence that plants have the consciousness that you need to suffer. I know that many years ago there was a book published called The Secret Life of Plants, which claimed not only that plants are capable of suffering, but they're even telepathic. Because this guy rigged up a lie detector to his philodendron, and he told people, he had people in two groups. He told some people to go into the room and light the cigarette lighter and start burning the plant's leaves, and other people to go into the room and do something nice to the plant, water it or something like that. And he claimed that when the people with the intention of burning the plant's leaves came into the room, the lie detector showed responses that it didn't show with the other people. Very interesting data. Unfortunately, when other people tried to repeat this experiment, nobody could get the same outcome. So I don't think that plants can feel pain, and so I don't think we can harm plants in the sense in which I'm talking about harming animals. Now, suppose you could do that. This was your first question, I think. Suppose you could do that to animals. Suppose we could have decorticate animals, remove the cortex, if you like, so that they don't feel anything. They're sort of zombies. Well, that would eliminate the argument from animal suffering, because there would be no animal suffering. The environmental arguments would still be there, and I'm not sure really whether the animals would be able to feed themselves either. Somehow you'd obviously have to remove the capacity to suffer, but not the capacity to actually notice that food was inside them, unless you were just going to rig them up with tubes and feed them that way. So like a patient in a hospital on a feeding tube. This is starting to get very complicated, and I would guess very expensive. There may be a better alternative. You might have read just a month or so ago in London, there was the first tasting of in vitro meat. In vitro meat doesn't involve an animal at all. It takes cells from an animal and grows them in a lab. So it produces a tissue culture, which is actually meat in a strict biological sense. I mean, it is made of meat cells grown together. So there was this tasting. People said, yeah, it tastes like hamburger, you know, neither better nor worse. And it cost about $300,000 to produce. So you're not going to see it in your supermarket next month. But, you know, as with many research things, once you scale up, you might bring the cost down. And if you could bring the cost down and it did taste okay, it's clearly there's no animal suffering involved. There is no methane produced, so environmentally the footprint for global warming is dramatically reduced. So I'd be fine with that. I'd have no problems with eating that kind of meat. Now, did I miss out one of the three things that you asked about? I got the first and the last, but I can't remember now what was the middle.
There weren't any environmental.
Oh, so if there weren't any environmental problems, but well, are there still the animal welfare problems, right? If there were no environmental problems and there were no animal welfare problems and the animals had good lives, yeah, okay, you know, I mean, maybe I would accept that, but I just would not really be prepared to say that this could be a commercial system that feeds a large population, because I just don't believe, I mean, this is assuming that the animals are capable of suffering, I just don't believe that it will remain free of suffering. It's, you know, you can just look at what happens. Even when there are laws that say there are certain things you can't do to animals, even though the laws permit the forms of factory farming that I showed, they don't permit, for example, picking up a piglet, let's say it's a runt that's not going to do well and not worth feeding, they don't permit you to pick up a piglet, just grab it by the tail and bash its head against the bar. But you can go online and see videos, go to People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals or Mercy for Animals, some of those organizations. You can see videos taken undercover in factory farms of workers doing just that. You know, there's videos of workers at slaughterhouses sort of amusing themselves during their lunch break by taking a live chicken and using it as a football. So this is a problem, that when you have people who have complete power over animals and they're not being closely supervised, you're going to get all sorts of abuses. And if this is happening on a large scale, you're going to get a significant number of abuses.
So here's another question. Suppose you're in a social situation, right, in which meat is on the table, so to speak. So some people want to know what's the appropriate thing to do there. If you really sort of feel the vegetarian argument strongly, is the right thing to do to refuse the meat that's there, possibly offend your host, possibly let that meat then just go to waste, right? Or is the appropriate thing to do to, you know, in that situation, accept the meat that's offered to you?
So obviously the best thing to do is to tell your host when you're invited that you're a vegetarian or vegan, and your host will provide for you. But yeah, it can sometimes happen that you forget to do this, or circumstances where you didn't get a chance to do this. So that situation can occur. You might say, well, since if the meat is going to be wasted anyway, I might as well eat it. But the other factor to consider is that what we do sets an example. Let me tell you about my own case. I wasn't born a vegetarian. I grew up in Australia where for the first 20-odd years of my life, I ate quite a lot of meat. Australia's a big beef and lamb producing country, and meat was cheap and plentiful. I then went to Oxford to do my graduate work, so I was already 24 or something like this. And in Oxford, students eat in colleges, and there was another philosophy student that I was sitting, or actually going into dinner to lunch with. And at that time in the college, essentially there was one hot meal served and there was a salad. So the hot meal that was served was spaghetti with a kind of nondescript brown sauce poured over the top of it. This is England, remember. It's got better, This is a long time ago. And my friend said, "What's in the sauce?" And they said, "It's a meat sauce." So he said, "Can I have the salad plate?" Which had no meat on it. So I took the spaghetti and I sat down next to him, and we were talking about something completely different for a while. But after that, I said, "So why did you refuse the spaghetti? Don't you eat meat?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" And I sort of expected maybe he would say something like, "Well, I believe in reincarnation, and I think this cow might have been my grandmother," or I didn't quite know what. But at that time, you didn't meet many people who were ethical vegetarians just because they were concerned about animals. But that is essentially what he said. He said, "Look, I care about animals and I don't want to eat them." And that actually was the moment when I started thinking about this. I'd never really thought of this as a significant ethical issue. And I must admit, at first, I thought about it as a bit of a puzzle. I remember I was a philosophy student. We like puzzles. And I thought, so what is it that justifies us in treating animals the way we do? When, of course, if this was if this was human meat, if this was cannibalism, we would be appalled by the idea. So why are animals different, and how is their difference justify us in what we do to them? And I thought about that for some weeks and tried to read what I could and found nobody had written very much about it, which was a bit surprising in itself. And what they had written, when eventually I found a few philosophers, Kant had written about it, but seemed really misconceived. And eventually I decided I couldn't justify it. And that's when I became a vegetarian, and that's why I'm here talking to you about this. So don't underestimate the power of your example. And if you are in that situation, even if it is going to make your host a bit uncomfortable and you're going to feel a bit embarrassed about it, I think it's worth showing to other people that you do have ethical grounds for not eating meat.
So that leads nicely into another question that people have, which is, in the time that you've been writing about this and speaking about this issue, how have you seen things change? How much change have you seen over the last several decades? And what sort of change do you expect to see in the future, or according to different possibilities depending on what we do?
Right. Good question. So there's been a lot of change in this whole area of the ethics of food. People didn't really think about the ethics of food in general. So far as, obviously, one of the issues that I touched upon, climate change, in the 70s, when I got interested in this, nobody was talking about climate change. That really started, I guess, in the mid-80s. People started thinking about this, and obviously it's dramatically increased more recently. So that wasn't an issue at all. The animal welfare issue, there were definitely animal welfare organizations, but they were not focused on farm animals. They were focused on companion animals, dogs and cats, perhaps horses. And then there were specific groups focused on the use of animals in research. But there were virtually no organizations that were focused on farm animals. So there wasn't much attention to that. There were also as I said, very few vegetarians, and those that were vegetarians either for religious reasons or because of their health. Very few concerned about the ethics of eating meat. And the word vegan wasn't really even known. Nobody would have understood if you'd started talking about being a vegan. And you certainly wouldn't have seen, as I saw, say, just at the airport flying out of New York, Au Bon Pain had vegan soup label. So you would never have seen a label that said anything vegan at that time. So there's been a huge growth in awareness of these issues. Have there been improvements in the way animals are treated? Well, a little. I mentioned, for example, the California initiative, and I said that the European parliamentary democracies have gone a lot further. In fact, the entire European Union now has laws that prohibit the individual stalls for veal calves and for sows, and also prohibit the standard battery cage for hens, although they still do allow hens to be in cages, but they have to have a lot more room than in the US. They have to have a nesting box that they can lay an egg in, because that's a strong instinct of hens to lay in a sheltered, protected kind of area. So there has been some progress in the way animals are treated, but not nearly enough. And the counterbalancing thing to the fact that there has been some progress is that worldwide there is now a lot more meat produced. Not so much for this country, where actually meat consumption has, after rising for many decades, has now plateaued and even started to dip a little bit. But if we look at it globally, there's a huge increase in meat consumption in Asia, especially in China, to some extent in India. And that dramatically outweighs the dip in meat consumption in the United States and some of the affluent Western nations. So unfortunately, there's a lot more animals in factory farms now than there were in the 1970s.
So there are many more interesting questions, but not enough time. Please all join me in thanking Professor Singer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt.